Oftentimes we have our usual suspects of speakers who return year in and year out, folks from PSU and Lewis and Clark and Reed and U of O and OSU, and I always love when we can bring a new voice into the Great Decisions program. And I'm very, very excited that we have with us today Dr. William Hatungimana, who is going to talk about U.S. engagement with Africa. There is a lot going on. We just had the African Union Summit. This morning there were sanctions released against Sudan. There is so much in the mix, and certainly there's a lot of sort of crystal ball of trying to figure out which way the wind blows with regard to U.S. engagement in Africa. And so I'm excited that we have the professor with us today. William teaches courses on immigration, contemporary Africa, and international conflict and conflict resolution at the U of O. His research mainly focuses on attitudes towards immigrants. He explores the influence of material and symbolic factors on attitudes towards immigrants in Africa. He also conducts research on immigration, political legitimacy, democracy, and Africa-China relations. And I believe you were working on 1 or 2 or 3 different books on different things, which we may get to in the Q&A. But without further ado, big hand.
Okay, so thank you very much again for having me. So today I'll try and see if I can answer this question. So it's a very difficult. Oh yeah, okay. It's a tough question to answer, but I'm gonna try. So you can be gentle on me when it comes to questioning, because I might not have all the answers. So we are pretty much trying to ask the question: what lesson can the United States learn from China's presence in Africa, and how might it strengthen ties with leading African nations? So the way I try to approach this question is mostly from the public's perspective. And I think if you're thinking about continuity in terms of foreign policy, especially in legitimacy, if you're thinking from the United States perspective, one has to look at it instead of from elites. One has to look at it from the public, what the public think about the US or China. And I think there we can learn more in terms of trying to identify what the US can do to improve its favorability versus China. So how I'm gonna approach this here, it's my clicker is not. Okay, I'll just click here. My clicker is not, yeah. Okay, there you go. It works now. Yeah.
Is your microphone open here? I'm sorry, sir. Let's see. Turn this volume down.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the clicker works now. Yeah.
And then what about your microphone? Is it? Oh, hang on 1 second here.
Yeah.
Good.
Should be on.
Microphone. Oh, let's go.
You're gonna open it up. Okay.
There we go. I'm so sorry, sir.
No problem.
Does your clicker work?
Yeah, my clicker is working now. Yeah. So the way I'm gonna try and look at it. What has China done? Because when you look at public opinion, favorability to what China has been increasing in Africa. So what has China done that what the U.S. can look at in terms of improving its favorability? So we're going to look at issues regarding infrastructure projects in Africa, China's infrastructure project. Then you will see also U.S. soft power, that the image, how the U.S. image actually improved its favorability in Africa. Then obviously looking at public opinion and the people, to what extent are they pragmatic in how they see China, meaning seeing the U.S. and more as a partner in terms of the betterment of their life, or it's not just because they love the U.S., so in that case. Then credibility in terms of the image that the U.S. projects, or that how can that people believe that image in that way. So I'm going to juxtapose the U.S. and China. Mostly start with talking with China, then kind of bring in the U.S. Yeah. My clicker again. What's going on? Okay. So why public opinion? So I think if we borrow from Joseph Nye, who coined the term soft power, trying to understand how a country's image, especially a country with as powerful as the U.S., how can it have some kind of like attraction of how can it draw some favorability? And in this case, we have to think about soft power because it's attraction and it's persuasion and agenda setting. That means how do you influence the public of the country you are engaging with to buy into your policy, foreign policy. So without coercing, so that would be juxtaposed with hard power, which is military, and So soft power will be, it can be media, it can be culture, like for example, I watched a lot of American movies when I was growing up. So that influenced my image even before I came to the U.S. Even music. So that is soft power. So you will see that when it comes to the economy, to what extent aid plays a role, it's still a debate because aid has an economic part in that way. But debate among scholars to what extent aid is part of soft power. But just take it as an attraction, which can be cultural, so building the image, which then shapes legitimacy, because I have to believe into the foreign policy narrative of the U.S., for me to be drawn to the U.S. or to be favorable to U.S. Versus China. Yeah. So it depends on credibility. So do I believe? So if U.S. say, I am for democracy, do I believe that? So that's important. People have to believe it on the ground. Yeah. So since legitimacy is socially constructed in this case, so the media is going to play a role. Like growing up, I used to watch CNN in Eswatini when I was growing up there. Yeah, so CNN, I watched the news, and even though it was CNN World, there is an American perspective in how they, but then that influenced my opinion toward the U.S., and I learned a lot about the U.S. engagement across the world by just watch. So that is part of soft power, and again, movies, entertainment, and all. Yeah. So this is important because government may sign agreement. They might have certain deals with a country in which they're engaging with, like the U.S. But citizens have a role to play. They determine the long-term relationship or the nature of the relationship, because elites will come and go, leaders come and go, but citizens will still be there. So that's how important public opinion is. So yeah. So, and this guarantees stability. If it's winning the hearts and minds of the citizens, so in that way you have stability because citizens are going to continue being there. It's not just this one leader that you have connection with or elites. Even parties in democratic countries, they will lose power in that way. So continuity it makes sense that citizens have a huge role to play. Yeah. So if there's perceived exploitation or unreliability, then you're going to see negative attitudes toward a country that is engaging with the country that a citizen belongs to. Yeah, so, and you might see more resistance. So that is the gist of trying to understand like why the public is important. So when you look at public opinion in Africa, here you can see that when you look at so this Afrobarometer, it's a Pan-African survey which they do it periodically. So you can see from 2021 to 2023, then another one from 2024 to 2025. And you can see when you compare, you can see that China favorability is higher than the US, and China has become the leading trading partner of most African countries. So you can see then also when you look at Pew, which is based in the US, you can also see more favorability of China than the US, and you can see in a country as Nigeria or in a country like South Africa. Yeah. So when we want to gauge influence, we have to think about experiences of ordinary people, because they do influence that. So when they see railroad, like stadium, investment in energy or telecommunication project, it's visible. They see it. They know, China is involved in this, and that influence, especially when China's media is also expanding in Africa, so that is swaying people's attitudes toward China and how China positions itself against the US or against the West. So then long-term, you can see here a long-term development symbol. So there is like you're going to build, it's more like a building monuments to a certain extent, what people are going to remember. And you are meeting them somehow where they are in terms of building infrastructure, roads, railways. That becomes an influence on their perception. Yeah. So what China has done, so they have, they finance projects in Africa, and these projects has been like brands, This is China Corporation, infrastructure. They framed it because you have to have an image, creating an image as in relation to soft power in this case. So an image of, win-win cooperation. So juxtaposing is like, this is not like the IMF giving you a loan, So we are giving you this so that you can develop. We can all win together, So that's how they are comparing themselves to the US. Then reinforce sovereignty-centered development narrative. They don't interfere in countries' political affairs, so the non-interference, that's how they call it in that case. Think about also participation linked to improved, so this pretty much lead to improved perception of China. Then obviously they have FOCAC, where China lays its plan for Africa, and a lot of leaders buy into this, and they message to their population to a certain extent. So this improves its relationship with African countries. But the U.S., it's not like the U.S. is out of the picture. It's strongly, the U.S. is still in the picture, pretty significantly still in the picture. It's not like China is running away with it in this case. You can see when you ask people which development model they prefer, they actually prefer the U.S. So you can see China is involved, is invested a lot in the media. They have exchange with journalists, and they have broadcast partnership, all that. CGTN, China Daily, it's mostly can be accessed. It can be accessed in Africa, and the headquarters actually is in Kenya, or CGTN. So you can see the media influence that shapes perception in this case. Yeah. So soft power in this case, China, I think it's pretty much looking at, it's more of a multi-pronged approach. You think of from media and infrastructure, which shapes image. Yeah. So when we think about whatever China is doing, in this case, we have to think about, and what the US can do, we have to think about people priorities. So you can see, when you ask people a question about what they think the government should be concerned about mostly, you can see health is up there, education, unemployment, infrastructure, water supply, crime, security, democracy. And you can see how both China and the US can look at that and see where can we find a way to gain some soft power advantage. So in Nigeria here you can see crime security is part of the priorities, and you see electricity, increase in cost of living, poverty, unemployment, all those kind of things. So it's pretty much, if you are looking at this and you work for the US government, you have to be thinking about what issue do I try to address so that I can win the hearts of and minds of the African, the Nigerian in this case. And the South Africa too, you can see crime and security is still up there, and you can see infrastructure as part of it, health. And this is how where you start looking, and you can see how China is mostly focused on infrastructure and trying to shape its image. So here, when you think about aid, you can see US has advantage. Mostly health, you can see here, there, the US, it's about 108 billion. So that's a big chunk of, that's before, obviously. We're not talking, we know what happens, the cuts and everything. So the US has an advantage, especially when you also look at humanitarian assistance. Here you also, emergency response, the US has some advantage because that's where it spent a lot of money. But when you look at energy, infrastructure, and transportation, you can see when you compare it to China, China has a much bigger spending in those sectors. So you can construct health, then China is mostly on the infrastructure side, and that's how it gets to sways people opinion. So it's like which issue does one country focus on to sway people's opinion? And you can see that different approaches from like different superpowers trying to compete for the hearts and minds of Africans. So here, this is just putting, so this is a survey that we conducted in Zimbabwe. It's just trying to put things into perspective. You know that Zimbabwe is under sanction, but despite the sanction, when you ask Zimbabweans, which vaccine would you prefer? They will prefer the US vaccine, so over China. But obviously, when you ask them, when you include South Africa, they still prefer, because it's a regional power in this case. But when you compare these two, you still see that the US still, there's a lot of trust for US products. And that shows that, yeah, China might be gaining in terms of public opinion, but the US is still there, is still competitive. Then the US still retain favorability in health, humanitarian aid. Obviously now we are talking about, now it's a different story. We have to think about, yeah. So traditionally the US has gained most favorability, yeah, through health, spending health and humanitarian aid. However, obviously you see that when you talk about China's, the US influence, this study by Martin actually shows that, yeah, baseline, the US has some advantage, but when you make people aware about China's investment, you actually see China gaining. So it's all about that market. That's why China is spending a lot of money in media in Africa. So this is just giving you like an idea of in terms of, this is from Gallup. So it's showing public opinion. So you can see the US public opinion here, it improves. It continues to improve to some extent, but also in some countries it has decreased. So it's not like US public opinion is just going negative. So it depends. That's why you have to sometimes disaggregate these things and try and understand it country by country, to, you know, even though I'm talking broadly right now. You can see here too, even China has been gaining, but also has been losing favorability to some extent. So one thing to learn here is you see that, no, it's not like it's a zero-sum game in the minds of most Africans. They can have a favorable view of China, and they can also have favorable view of the U.S., you know, so that there's that competitiveness between the two countries. That is that pragmatic part, you know. They are looking who can be our best partner to improve our lives, and they are seeing all these two competing superpowers, and obviously their opinions was them. It's going to be dependent on how they see these superpowers helping or improving their life. Yeah. So it's performance, outweigh ideology. So it's not like they're just buying into rhetoric. They are looking at things on the ground. When you look at infrastructure, when you look at hospitals, you know, build or have a logo of the USAID, you know, where I grew up, you will see that at the clinics, you know, so I've seen that, you know. So I can see how it influence people's perception in this case. So this, when they see that and the people see being helped in that case, then you can see why people will have favorability to a country that they perceive as helping them. Yeah. So here the U.S. soft power, humanitarian aid, PEPFAR. We talk about PEPFAR. We know they've been cuts to PEPFAR here. Especially in Nigeria and also in South Africa, yeah. But we can see here that emergency response give the U.S. an advantage in terms of soft power, then obviously democracy. But democracy, to a certain extent, democracy promotion sometimes can bring other issues because then some Africans, even leaders, will think the U.S. is being paternalistic and trying to impose. So in this way, that can be a double-edged sword, even though the U.S. is heavily involved in civil society. And yeah. So, yeah, and investment in healthcare, you see that has, yeah, given the U.S. A lot of advantage in soft power. And the influence of PEPFAR, you know, actually, you can credit it to Bush in this case because it was under Bush, and also the President Maralia initiative. All these policies were under Bush, and they improved U.S. favorability. So PEPFAR saved millions of lives in Africa, even in Eswatini, where I grew up. So it's like Eswatini was devastated by HIV, by AIDS, and when I think after 2003, when PEPFAR was introduced, we start seeing retroviral drugs coming into and actually making people infected, giving a longer, you know, lifespan for people who are infected with HIV. So you can see how it has an impact on people. At the same time, you can see how it builds image. Yeah. So, but now there's temporary aid suspension, so we don't know to what extent. So there are studies that are still being done, and looking at to what extent as these somehow dented the U.S. image, you know, across the world. Yeah. So, but U.S. You can think about soft power depends on domestic examples. So one has to think about when the U.S. is preaching democracy to a certain extent, it has to also show democracy at home. So now how are these countries going to perceive the U.S. In terms of what is happening here versus what they are promoting abroad? So there is major decline in democracy across the globe, even in Africa. A lot of coups, so it's a global trend. But if U.S. had to project itself as a leader, it has to actually live by example. So that can affect attitude toward the U.S. But the U.S. still plays a major role. If you think about historically, the U.S. has been playing. And if you think like this is just an administration that's going to pass, so we can actually have a more hopeful, tone in terms of how we talk about how the U.S. The soft power. It might be just a slump, and we might see difference in public opinion toward the U.S. as administration change. So the messaging abroad is important, obviously, but you have to show what you are preaching at home too. Then also democratic backsliding, obviously, what you see in the U.S. Does affect public opinion based on that. So in the cases of like Nigeria here, you can see Africa largest population. Then you can see about about 232 million, and you can see the GDP here. Then there's been a lot of investment, China's investment, but there's also been a lot of investment in health, the U.S. So this is how much? 7.8 billion. So it's supported 90% of Nigeria HIV treatment. That's very significant. So when you withdraw that, you see what kind of impact that can have. And you can see how much prevalence of HIV it reduced. So it has an impact. Then you can see different. These are experiences people have. They experience Chinese infrastructure, then U.S. health and humanitarian service. They do experience them. This affect their public opinion to that is their perception toward the U.S. and this affects the success of U.S. Interest in Africa. So here you can see that competition. If you think about it, the U.S. and China, you have to think about experiential. What are people feeling? When think about their priorities, is the U.S. think about people's priorities? And in South Africa, also, you can see South Africa, you have to, when you talk about it in relation to China, you have to be a bit cautious because it's in the BRICS, so you're gonna see more favorability toward China. Because so South Africa, you're gonna see pretty much more because they have more economic cooperation with China. But South Africa is more democratic, and there's free press, so you can see competition in terms of media. It's not like an authoritarian regime where if the government is working with China, it can just influence public opinion. So there will be a more competitive media arena in which you might see influence from both the U.S. and China. So also, yes, in terms of HIV, PEPFAR, the U.S. also has played a major role in terms of just like retroviral drugs and prevention. And we're going to see how this impact the perception as we go, if the current policies do continue. So comparing strategic model, we can see visibility of infrastructure. That's what China is pretty much, that's China's approach. Then sovereignty, rhetoric, non-interference. Then BRI, branding, the Belt and Road Initiative. We're going to work together and help countries develop in terms of trade. Then media, the CGTN and China Daily and Xinhua and CCTV. You see that in Africa, and it's been expanding, and it's been shaping public opinion. The U.S. Institutional partnership, you can think about issues like democracy, then health programs, then government's emphasis, but they might not have a strong branding visibility. So how does the U.S. improve its visibility in terms of branding? We see it in health, but what about other dimensions? Yeah. So lessons for U.S. increase visibility of development partnership, provide uninterrupted healthcare support, strengthen digital diplomacy, align foreign policy credibility with domestic democratic renewal. So that's how U.S. And it's not like U.S. images. People change in their perception. So the U.S. can, in terms of if they approach a different foreign policy strategy, they take a different strategy. They might actually influence, regain the advantage that they've been having for years. Yeah. So this is what Blinken said. Stop treating Africa as a subject of geopolitics and to pursue a policy that is not about China or any other third party. It's about Africa. And I think that's a good message. It's like, what do Africans want? What do they prioritize? So once you understand that, then that can help address some of the issue that regards to favorability of the U.S. Versus China. So how do you measure? So obviously, to measure success, there's public opinion out there, public opinion data, if you're mostly emphasizing on people, on the people. So then increased trust, then obviously health service continuity, because that's been the strength. Obviously project which improve local employment. As you saw, the priorities that people had, employment was one of the top. Then youth exchange participation. And the U.S. has been having like student exchange programs that has helped also in terms of like soft power improvement. Then you have also public opinion. Look at the public opinion pretty much. See what people think and try and pursue foreign policies approaches that addresses what people are concerned about. Yeah, so in conclusion, so strategic competition in Africa centers on visibility, reliability, and credibility. So China has managed to do that using through infrastructure development. Then you can see the U.S. advantage has been in institution health, and then in that way the U.S. can focus on that and try and boost its image. Or obviously expand beyond. Those are not just, I'm just laying out where the U.S. has been having most advantage. They can expand their dimension in terms of how they approach soft power. Yeah. And think about, obviously, be pragmatic. Okay, that's the end. Yeah, ready? Question?
Okay, thank you so very much. There's a phrase that I read often, which is that from African leaders, that when China comes there, they get a bridge or they get a railroad. When the U.S. comes, they get a lecture. But what we're seeing is a strategic switch to a more transactional, a more security-focused, and a more resource-driven engagement. Are we becoming more like China with a client relationship, and is it a mistake to have this kind of engagement that doesn't at least take into account the human rights pieces in that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because China doesn't emphasize a lot on human rights. Yeah, so I'll say that's the strength of the U.S., but the U.S. has to think about how they approach that issue without sounding very paternalistic. So how do they engage with African countries in terms of like promoting human rights in a way that the African countries don't feel like they're being imposed upon. and also it relates to the history when African countries are thinking about, oh yeah, you got rid of Gaddafi, but we have like conflicts in Libya, you know, and obviously in Mali, where the U.S. has been engaged, we see Mali's actually the ties with the U.S. have soured, you know, especially after the military coups, you know. So this kind of gives a hint like, how do we approach human rights? It's an important, I have to care about it. Every human has to care about it, but how do we approach it? I think that's the question. Then in terms of like, yeah, Biden going to Angola and trying to, the Lobito corridor, trying to find ways they can create like means of transporting mineral resources, so obviously for U.S. interest. Yeah, so one has to think is like, there is no problem with trade, but as long as people don't feel swindled, you know, when it comes to agreements. So as long as there is a fair exchange, I think when people feel that there is a fair exchange, then the relationship will improve. And when they see people, that people see that the relationship is actually improving their life, then in that way, yeah, it's not like the U.S. what historically like prompting giving resources to dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko of the Zaire, and you know, so that he was a kleptocrat, and you can see how that can influence how the U.S. is viewed. So changing foreign policy in terms of mostly thinking about the people and how the foreign policy can help the people, instead of strongly about how it can help U.S., you know. So it has to be a kind of quid pro quo, yeah, and fair, yeah.
So we've got a question from somebody online. The U.S. has a long history of promoting transparency in Africa and elsewhere. How did Africans perceive that, and is that changing under the current U.S. administration?
Yeah, so yeah, we can look at transparency and think, oh yeah, it's a way, I'm sure that when a democratic country has more transparency, so if you think about promoting democracy or reducing corruption, and in that case, you're thinking, but is that consistent? So you're saying, like, was it consistent, whatever policy was there? So again, you have to think about, was issues of transparency, like for example, in a country like former Zaire, or if you're thinking about the transparency in terms of a country like Mali, to what extent is the U.S. pretty much doing, practicing what it's preaching, you know? So we can't see, when we see the U.S. supporting like El-Sisi in Egypt, we have to, is that a good, is that an honest message? You know, so if you're thinking about that, then if you're starting to question it in this case, then it becomes just rhetoric, transparency, and because there's lack of consistency. But if the U.S. will partner with the local government and pretty much be honest about its attempt to improve transparency, then you can see you can see like better engagement in this case. So it's about issues about the interests. As long as they are mutual and they are honest in that way, then there is less rhetorical and more substance, pretty much, rather than rhetoric. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's my understanding that yes, China does a lot with the BRI for infrastructure creation, but I have the impression that does not translate into a much higher use of the country's indigenous labor, because they bring a lot of Chinese to do it and manage it and so forth. How is that received? Yeah, you get something, you got a bridge, but you don't have employment.
Indeed, yeah. And you see, employment is one of the major issues, yeah. And yeah, so and there've been protests There've been protests in Chinese mines, even just people discontent about that issue, where China doesn't actually hire the locals and it brings its own employees. So that has been an issue. And there's also human rights violation in the mines of Chinese-owned factories. So those are issues that has been lingering, and there've been protests. So and in a country like Zimbabwe, where China is heavily involved, actually the public opinion toward China are lower compared to the U.S. So they are lower, and that kind of gives you an idea that you think when the ruling party is strongly engaged with China, you think there will be more favorability, but that's not the case because of the issue that you're actually citing, and also environmental degradation in these mines. Those are other issues that people raise, against China. And I think that then speaks to, are people weighing cost and benefit in that case? Based on the average public opinion, you can say yes, but when you start disaggregating it to like country level differences, and even you can even go down regional, where the mine is, where people are actually seeing the degradation, then you start seeing differences. So this is average. This is not like, does not show the picture when you break it down at the local level. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a particular interest in South Africa because I did business there during the years Nelson Mandela was president. And I read recently in The Economist magazine that the reforms Cyril Ramaphosa has implemented are beginning to make significant improvements in things like the electric grid and other things that affect the economy and the people there. So my question is, do you agree with that? And are either the U.S. or China or both doing anything to help with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, yeah, South Africa, there is this load shedding when you hear it's, you pretty much find a way to save electricity. And so load shedding will happen, it's like one part of the city, they will have electricity, and while the other part of the city doesn't have, so that they save the electricity that they have. And because there's been an inconsistent supply of electricity, South Africa has been facing. But that is a bigger problem in terms of when you think about corruption in South Africa. Even under the ANC, to a certain extent. And if you look at the election, you can see the opposition party, the DA, Democratic Alliance, got a lot of votes, and they're actually in coalition with the ANC. And due to that coalition, you see different policy shifts, which try to address issues of like corruption, energy supply, and I think for me, I become very skeptical. Do I agree? I think I have to see long-term change for me to say, yeah, there are changes. So I think I don't entirely agree until I see more change. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Neither the article that we read nor your talk has mentioned global warming or green energy. And I wonder particularly if you would address those topics vis-a-vis China versus the US, as well as maybe the relationship to drought and famine. Thank you.
Yeah, those are pressing issues actually right now. Yeah, so in terms of issues of global, I don't think China, we know that China builds a lot of electric cars and tries to export them, but are they matching that, what they are doing domestically? Do we see more policies, what China is claiming to try and push for more sustainable development? Do we see those claims actually showing up? I don't think in Africa we have seen that. They're talking issues about environmental degradation in the mines, even waterways being contaminated and all that, if you think about pollution on the ground, if you, so that I don't think the U.S., neither the U.S., even under the current administration, even in the U.S. we still ask, those questions, under the current administration, I don't think there's heavily a push for more sustainable development, and I don't see China proactively or strongly doing that in Africa. And I think that's a question that should be, when you're thinking about development, you think about sustainability, especially when you're talking about the people. One has to think that, it might be a short-term benefit for the people, but you think about long-term, and what we are calling the development can actually be destructive.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm wondering, I've read that the youth in Africa can make a very possible change in the relationship between the U.S. and Africa. And I'm wondering, how would you define the quality of the African education, and how much propaganda is there changing the minds of our youth, African youth?
So that's because we did a study in Zimbabwe looking at Western media influence and China media influence on. So we drew, the sample was mostly educated people in the urban areas. And we do find it's not like education doesn't have an influence. It does to some extent, but exposure to Chinese news outlets actually positively influence public opinion. And the other way around, exposure to Western media influence actually improve public opinion toward the U.S. So in terms of, then we have another factor there, which is partisanship. So in Zimbabwe, even though it's not entirely a democracy, but we have party competition. You have the opposition and incumbent party. And we find that actually opposition party supporters have a more negative attitude toward China. But incumbent party supporters have more positive. So there are many influences. When you think about education, it's one of them. But there are also other influences like partisanship that are interacting with education. So you will think because we drew from highly educated urbanites, we'll see more, we see more favorability toward the U.S. because of the exposure. Because China's media, even though it's expanding, is not as influential. It's not as the U.S. The U.S. still have strong influence, because of the legacy, pretty much. So education does play a role, but there are other factors interacting with education.
Hi there. Thank you for the talk. I have a related question about, given that so much of the U.S. and its multilateral partners' investments in Africa has been in health and human rights and tended to focus on needs-based kind of population from the perspective of serving refugee camps and IDP camps and things like that, like serving people who tend to be more marginalized in their own home countries. I wonder how that is going to influence public perception within those countries. And then when we think about pressure on governments, upward pressure on governments to deliver services, I think there's been a lot of hope that this will translate into increased social pressure on governments to deliver basic health services and things like that. My worry is that because so much of the previous investments from the international community led by the US have focused on people who tend to be on the fringes of their societies, that I wonder if you think that there will be that pressure from populations at large, and if that will ultimately translate into governments providing more goods for their people.
Can I talk about civil society in that case? Yes. Oh, sorry. You're talking about civil society. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. So if you think about any social movement, one has to think about to what extent is the broader population engaged, and the success is actually determined by that. As I said, when it comes to issues of, regarding improving democracy, sometimes the U.S. is viewed as being paternalistic. Even you have even leaders who are coming out and saying that. So if it, yeah, focusing on the fringe, the population and the fringes, strategically, one can say maybe politically that's not a, a very effective way. But then if one does not focus on the fringe, who will focus on the fringe? So are those policies like useful? I think that's one have the, to some extent, especially when one takes issues that that people have to be aware about. If it's marginalization of certain ethnic groups. But I'll go back. How legitimate is the engagement? Is it because why these leaders speak out is because they think like there is an attempt for regime change, because of the history, So if the U.S. is involved with certain group, like maybe the opposition party in Zimbabwe, to what extent do people think that it's genuine? It's for the people. Right? I think that's where you gauge the success, and there's more cooperation when people think, no, this is beneficial. Yeah, and don't give a lot of reasons for the incumbent government, because they will find a scapegoat, obviously. Every time, it's just the U.S. agenda. No, there's democracy in this country. Look, people are happy and all that, that they will use that kind of rhetoric. But if it's more, it's a more like honest, the U.S. is more forthcoming in its intention, I think, then we can see those people actually in the fringes benefiting from the relationship with the U.S. Because then the broader population is more likely to listen.
So we've got time for one question, and I'm going to actually ask that question. So the 39th Ordinary Session of the Assembly of the African Union just concluded this week, and I'm wondering what were some key things that we should take away from that summit, and where do you see some positive momentum with regard to issues like regional conflict, aid and development, water security, and the U.S. influence, not just aid, but the change in trade policy, the change in immigration. How did that affect the conversations, and is there anything you were hopeful coming out of that?
So in terms of, so you're meaning U.S. foreign policy?
Well, what was the conversation at the African Union Summit, and what do you feel hopeful about coming out of that?
Okay, I'll first say the first question. I won't answer because I didn't follow the African, so I don't have enough information to speak to that. But I can talk broadly about in terms of what aspiration do Africa has, and how the U.S. can try and help Africa achieve their goals. So, yeah, issues like people think you'll hear it in China comes and pretty much responds to our need, like infrastructure, like then they see U.S. even though it's heavily involved in health, the issue of democracy promotion becomes like ideological. Yeah, so I think more pragmatic in terms of like meet the people where they are, the goals that the leaders are setting up. So is there a way, for example, if there's a free trade agreement that the African Union is trying to push for. How can the U.S. play a role in making that happen, especially when it speaks to economic growth, and in terms of like when you think about the IMF and the World Bank, how can they even switch their approach in how they think about loans, or in terms of like, yeah, if you have a loan, Kenya has a loan from, how do they address issues in terms of like servicing debt, because yeah, some countries do default, but it's how does one work with those countries to try and actually help them grow, because in some cases China does restructure, even though there's an accusation of debt trap diplomacy, but obviously the evidence for that is not as as strong. First of all, but it does restructure its loans. So if the U.S. can think about that, and in terms of like who the U.S. is working with, I know one has to work with the government, but if it's a more honest way of trying to improve people's lives, that means the U.S. is going to find means to work with the government in a way that it benefits the people. So, yeah, to put it broadly, it's how best does the U.S. implement foreign policy in a way that it helps the people on the ground, and in the way that it improves people's lives. Because China is claiming to do that. I think the U.S. can show that they can do that, given their history. So the history is kind of mixed to some extent. So how do you improve on what? Does the U.S. improve on what it has been doing that has been perceived as being as good, and trying to pretty much avoid policies that have created more negative perception. So it's broad. It's not, my answer is not very policy oriented, pointing to that policy, but in general, it will go back again. It's the people. It's the people. Even though it's a democratic or autocratic regime, people still have influence, because the government only gets legitimacy from the people. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Okay, a big hand for. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Go out into the world, be safe, be well. Hopefully we'll see you next week for the last event. Again, visit our YouTube channel to see the ones that you missed. If you can, subscribe to the channel, because we're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, which gives us access to, secret social media revenue and things like that. So thanks so much.